I'm Dr. Michael Nevins. I'm a retired physician who has lived and worked in the Pascack Valley for more than 4 decades. As is evident from the present exhibition, many doctors have hobbies. Some paint, some sculpt, some photograph, and I'm no exception, except that mine is an intellectual hobby. Happens I'm a collector. But I don't collect stamps or antiques or old cars. What I collect are stories. Stories about doctors who lived and worked in other times, earlier times. And when my collection of stories reaches some critical mass, sometimes I write a book. And indeed, recently my 10th book on medical history was published. Well, about 6 months ago, I was having lunch nearby with a friend of mine who happens to know of my special interest in history, and he asked me whether I'd ever visited the Belskie Museum. And I replied that although I'd often passed by, I'd never actually set foot inside, and he suggested that if I did, I might be in for a surprise. But if I came, I should especially ask to be shown what's down in the basement. He wouldn't say anything more, and so that very same afternoon I wanted to clear up this mystery, and I drove over to the museum. And when I arrived, I was greeted by a spry senior citizen named Martin Hicks, and when I asked him to be taken downstairs, Martin's eyes seemed to light up. He led the way down, he unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and then it was my eyes which lit up. Because what I found was a replica of a sculptor's workshop, dusty old books, tools, sketches, plaster cast and models. There were frame sets of medallions and commemorative coins which depicted a pantheon of medical luminaries from Hippocrates to almost to the present. Several years ago, the medical illustrator Bob Demarest wrote a small brochure about the sculptor Abram Belskie, whom actually Bob had met briefly, and much of the material in that brochure came from a transcribed interview which Belskie gave later in life, and what I'll do now is to just very briefly give a biographical summary. So, Abram Belskie was born in London in 1907. He was the son of a poor Jewish tailor who'd fled pogroms in Tsarist Russia. And when the boy was 2, the family moved to Glasgow, Scotland. And as he grew up there, he displayed artistic talent, but the family couldn't afford drawing papers, so he often would draw chalk pictures on the sidewalls. And he gradually honed his skills. He won art scholarships, traveled in Europe, and eventually he opened his own studio in Glasgow. But Glasgow was too confining, and in 1929, Belskie sailed for America, and he arrived just 2 weeks after the stock market crash. Poor timing. He sought out an English sculptor named John Gregory, who had a studio in the city. And when he found him, Gregory said, "I don't know what you can do, but first thing is we have to change your name. We have to make it more kosher." So the ham was dropped from Abraham, and ever after he was known as Abram Belskie. Well, Gregory got a commission to do the facade of the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington. And he hired the young Scotsman to help. But the preliminary work was done right here in Closter at a studio which was run by the master stone carver, Robert Bailey. And that's why Abram Belskie came here and why he remained for 58 years. One of the artists who sometimes worked at Bailey's was a well-known sculptor named Malvina Hoffman. She was quite a character, not in fact one of Abram's favorites, but as it turned out, she was influential in shaping his future career. As an aspiring young sculptor, Malvina had gone to Paris, and she briefly served there as assistant and really a secretary to Auguste Rodin, the sculptor. Rodin once told her that he regretted that he hadn't known more about human anatomy. Just imagine that for a moment. The great Rodin didn't know enough about human anatomy. And he suggested to Malvina that when she returned to New York, that she should do some formal study. And so World War I broke out, she had to return home, and so when she did, she sought out the chief of anatomy at Columbia's College of Physicians and Surgeons, a man by the name of George Huntington. And Dr. Huntington permitted her to dissect cadavers along with the medical students, and she did that for about 2 years. Well, Malvina Hoffman developed a reputation of her own as a sculptor, and apparently also maintained some of her contacts with the medical communities. And among her contacts was a Dr. Robert Latu Dickinson, who was a gynecologist and a pioneer in human sexuality, who had debunked various sexual myths. He had anticipated Alfred Kinsey's work by at least 15 years. And in 1933, he had published what became a classic, a book called Human Sexual Anatomy. In 1938, when the Maternity Center Association, what later became Planned Parenthood, wanted to have a display at New York's World's Fair, they approached Dr. Dickinson. Now, he was a medical illustrator in his own right, but by then he was over 70 years old, semi-retired, and the purpose of this project was to educate the public about pregnancy. And although Dr. Dickinson agreed to do it, he figured that he'd need physical help. Well, first he approached Malvina Hoffman. She wasn't interested. Apparently there wasn't enough money in the project for her. But instead, she suggested this young Scotsman from Bailey's studio in Closter. So what followed was a warm collaboration between Belskie and Dickinson, which lasted for more than a decade. And together, not only did they create this birth series, which appeared at the 1939 World's Fair and was viewed by millions, but other projects. The birth series consisted of life-sized representations of the uterus from conception to birth, all of which can be seen here downstairs. And the plaster series later was followed by another of lifelike latex models, which were used as teaching tools by generations of medical and nursing students. In fact, more than 160,000 sets were sold to schools and museums and the like. Well, Dr. Dickinson died in 1950, but Belskie carried on his work for nearly 4 decades. While working at his mentor's, beside his mentor at Dickinson's office at the American Academy of Medicine in New York, he sometimes wandered across the hall to the Academy's great medical library. And it was there that Belskie became enamored of medical history. And in time, he received a faculty appointment at New York Medical College, and over the ensuing years, he did various other projects. Not all medically related, but many were. Projects for the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Society, and the like. In 1969, he was commissioned by a commercial outfit to sculpt a series of commemorative medallions for a series which would be called Great Men in Medicine. First, a committee from the American Medical Association selected 50 famous doctors from ancient to modern times. Belskie then researched each subject, wrote an accompanying written description, and all of the plaster models and his notes are housed downstairs in the museum, as are sets of the coins which were minted from the plaster models. He was paid $1,200 for each of the 50 medallions, and they make a beautiful collection which warms this medical historian's heart. Now, Abram Belskie won many awards over his career, and in his acceptance speeches, he was fond of quoting Hippocrates, Shakespeare, and others, and his responses usually reflected his humanistic philosophy, and I'll just read one typical comment. He wrote once, "Art should be in the service of mankind. It is a privilege to work with one's hands, as sculptors do. In such work lies the secret of man's strength and fortitude, the balance of a confident mind and a stout heart. To work, to dream, to hope, to learn, to live deep instead of fast, to take root and to have borne fruit, this harmony, this is what man must live for. So you see, he was eloquent both with his tongue and with his hands. And during his long life in Closter, Abram Belskie made many friends, had many admirers. When he died, November 19th in 1989, the Lions Club of Closter raised money to build this museum in his memory. And although the doors opened in September of 1994, it took 18 years before I finally walked through them, and then only through serendipity. And to learn that a man who had been living so close by to me shared my passion for medical history. So for that, I'm grateful to the Lions Club and to the citizens of Closter. Thank you very much.